Are you looking at rebuilding your M50 out of your E36? Well, stay tuned, because in this video, I'm going to go through all the parts you're going to need and give you a rough idea of how much it's going to cost you. So we recently bought this E36 behind us, and unfortunately on the way home it overheated pretty badly, so it actually blew the head gasket. So we just took that as an opportunity to just do a full refresh of the motor, completely rebuild it from the ground up. So on this video, I'm just going to go through all the parts that we used and how much it cost us. That way, if you're doing a similar thing, you can get a better idea for yourself. For context, all prices will be in Australian dollars, because I'm in Australia, so it may vary depending on where you are and how cheap you are to get parts. If you do want to see more videos on the actual process, I've got a playlist on my channel of us building this car. We basically rebuilt the motor, did a manual swap, and did a few mods for drifting, so make sure you check that out after you watch this video. And while you're there, chuck it a subscribe. It helps me out a lot, so thanks for doing that, guys. But yeah, let's get into it. So once we had the engine pulled out of the car, we stripped it down to a bare block and head and took it over to a machine shop. So the first process is going to be to get your engine machined. We had the bores honed, the block and head decked. We also had them hot tanked, so washed. And we also, with the M50, there's an issue where there's a bit of a ridge that develops on top of the bores. So we had them carefully grind that ridge off best they can. So all the work in the machine shop came to $536, which is pretty pricey, but it is necessary to start with a good block and head to begin with. So starting with the bottom end, we replaced the piston rings. So we had new OEM piston rings. They were $165. We also reused the pistons and rods, but used new bearings, which were $55. The main bearings we also replaced, which are $115. We actually had to buy two sets because we damaged one with contaminating it from the plastic gauge. So just be careful, make sure your plastic gauge is clean, and you don't want to be buying two sets of bearings because that was pretty costly. But you know, you live and you learn. We also got new ARP rod bolts, which were $274, and new OEM Mainbolts, which are $200. It is a little bit expensive for bolts, but remember the stock bolts are actually stretch bolts, so you can only use them one time. So it's a good idea to replace them while you're there. We also replaced the oil pump drive gear, which was $92, and a new oil pump chain, which was $26. We were originally going to build a 3-litre, which I'm not sure if you know, but has issues with harmonics. So it's a good idea to replace these parts just because you don't want the oil pump nut backing out. So we didn't actually need those parts, but we figured even if we're just building a 2.5, it's still probably a good idea to replace them anyway. It is a drift car, so it's going to live at high RPM, so these parts probably might as well chuck them in. We also put a oil pump chain tensioner in. So we actually got it from a V-dub engine, so I'll put the part number in below, but basically we just put that on there just to reduce the slack of the oil pump chain. So it was only $16, so it's a good little upgrade that you can do while you're there, just to make sure that oil pump nut never comes loose. We also replaced the oil pickup gasket, which was $30. We actually forgot to get this part, so don't forget about this one. It's definitely something that you do want to replace because the old one's really brittle, and once you take it off, it's just going to crumble to pieces. And yeah, it's just cheap insurance, because if that gasket goes, you'll be sucking air into your oil pump and not oil, which is not a good thing. So now moving on to the head, we got a brand new OEM head gasket, which was $77. We also replaced the two dowels that locate the head. They're definitely a good idea to get fresh ones of these. They're only $11 for the pair. And we also got ARP head studs, which were $364. Not super necessary item, especially for an NA engine, but we figured might as well put it in. The head is probably going to be off a few times, and the OEM head bolts are a one-time use, so you might as well invest in some ARP studs that can be reused, and who knows, the engine might see some boost in the future. You never know. We also replaced both timing chain guides, which are $109. Again, good idea to replace them. The engines are getting old now, 20 or 30 years old, so the plastic becomes very brittle from the heat, and when you're taking them off, they pretty much crumble to pieces and you can't use them anyway. So you might as well just replace them for new ones. We also went with some spicy cams. So we actually went with an M50B25 intake cam. So you're actually required to cut a little bit of the Vanos spline down so it can work on the engine. And we actually went with an M50 non-Vanos intake cam on the exhaust, which also required a little bit of machining to work on our application. So the intake cam was $300 and the exhaust cam was $250, and that included all the modification that we needed to make them work for our engine. So we also replaced a bunch of seals and gaskets on the engine. As you can imagine, when you're rebuilding a motor, you don't want to be reusing any gaskets, so make sure you get all fresh gaskets. So I'm just going to do a rapid fire of which gaskets we replaced and how much they cost. So you had the Sump gasket, which was $45, the valve stem seals, which were $40, valve cover gasket, which was $38, valve cover grommets, which were $22, the timing chain cover gasket, there's two of them, they were $22 in total, the front main seal was $17, the rear main seal was $35, the rear main seal plate was $13, the intake manifold gasket was $19, the exhaust manifold gaskets were $44, that's for 3 of them, and the throttle body gasket was $8. An oil filter housing gasket was also $8. And we also replaced the oil filter, which was $16, and a fuel filter, which was $37. So definitely a lot of money on gaskets, but again, if you skip out on these, you're gonna basically end up with oil leaks and you don't really want that. So just replace as much gaskets as you can, and then you'll be done with it. So a few extras which you may or may not choose to include. I'll chuck them in, but yours might be okay. So we actually replaced the lower exhaust manifold nuts. They were $13 for a set of 6. We actually use N54 exhaust studs and nuts. So the nuts and the studs are a lot easier to work with. The studs have a little provision where you can put an e-torque socket, so they're a lot easier to put into the head. So the studs were $43 and the nuts were $55. We also replaced the idle control valve hose, which is $39. And the idle control valve connector. There's like a little plastic connector that connects to the back of the intake manifold. They usually go pretty bad. Again, these engines are like 20 to 30 years old now, so all the plastic's gone. So yeah, the connector was $24, the hose was $39. We also had to replace a few radiator hoses because the car had a 4-cylinder radiator in it, which probably didn't help and was probably why it was overheating. So we had to replace the lower rad hose and the upper rad hose. So the lower rad hose was $26 and the upper rad hose was $22, just because the hoses in the car were cut shorter to work with the shorter radiator. So we had to replace those. We also had to add the expansion tank and the expansion tank hose. So the expansion tank was $69 and the hose was $16. That was just using a generic hose because we actually deleted the spider hose which goes under the intake manifold. So now I've basically got a hose running from the expansion tank all the way to the back of the timing chain cover. So you can do that, it deletes a bunch of unnecessary stuff. And we deleted the heater so the coolant doesn't go into the cabin at all. But yeah, that is an option. We also had to replace one idler pulley, which was $32, the intake boot or the intake elbow, which was $36, and the 2 knock sensors were in 1,000 pieces, so we had to replace both of them, which was $169. Again, these are all extra items, so you might not have to buy them depending on your engine, but just something to keep an eye on, and I will be including them in the final tally. So I'm going to go through each category and tally it up. So we had the bottom end, including the machining on the engine, came to $1,509. The head itself, so that's head gasket and assorted parts, came to $1,111. All the seals in the engine came to a total of $363. And all the extras that I mentioned came to a total of $544. So that brought the engine to a grand total of, drumroll please, $3,527, which is quite a lot of money for an engine that's probably only making 140 kilowatts, whatever that is in horsepower. But Again, it was a good exercise. It was actually the first engine that I've ever rebuilt, so I'm really happy that I did it. It was a really great learning exercise, and I've definitely learned so much doing it. So really recommend you give it a go. There's plenty of info online for you to just be able to do it yourself. And also, I'm really stoked that now the engine's completely rebuilt. I know it's very healthy and I don't have to worry about it, and I can beat on the car without having too much sympathy if the engine's gonna blow up. We also use this engine as an exercise because I am gonna be rebuilding the M54 in my boosted E46. Obviously that's gonna be a fully built motor, so a much more expensive engine, and I really don't want to be messing that one up. So it's good to use this engine, which is really similar to the M54, just as a learning experience, and we definitely learned so much. So now I can apply that in rebuilding the M54. Fingers crossed I don't mess anything up when I rebuild the M54. But yeah, now we have all that knowledge, all that experience, and we can move on to rebuilding the M54. So make sure you stay subscribed for when we rebuild the built engine in the E46. It's gonna be pretty hectic. We are gonna be making a lot more power, and it's gonna be awesome. So get subscribed for that. So that's all for me. If you do have any questions, queries, all that jazz, make sure you chuck me a comment. Make sure I reply to all of them. I will be putting a full parts list in the description with all the part numbers. So make sure you check that out if you are struggling to finding the parts that I mentioned. Just double check the region that you're in and confirm fitment for the part numbers, because they are for Australian delivered E36s. So a few parts may be a little bit different depending on where you live in the world. But yeah, if you did get any value out of the video, make sure you chuck this video a like, chuck it a subscribe. It's literally free, helps me out so much. So thanks for doing that, guys. But yeah, that's all from me. Thanks so much for watching. Catch you on the next one. See ya.